to this computer. Good afternoon, Dr. Brian Adams. Lead Integrity is delighted to have this opportunity to have this conversation with you. Um, I think you know us already as one of our senior advisors who's kindly consented to join some months ago. So we're celebrating you as we come close to celebrating a year of our existence. We launched on March the 8th, International Women's Day of 2024. So we're coming close to our anniversary. And I just have to say that I say this with every single one of our interviews is we are women led, women of faith led, but not women centered or centric. We are simply a group of women professionals who came together in a space of trust and competence, each of us inspired by different faiths, to try to make the world, to avail our service, which is our knowledge, our wisdom, and our experience to the world of governmental, intergovernmental, and non-governmental actors. Our areas of expertise, as you well know, range from teaching at an elementary school for decades to professors in big universities to rocket scientists to medical doctors, engineers. It's a vast array of experience that is embodied by each one of us, a minimum of 20 to 25 years of professional experience of service. All of us believe in servant leadership. None of us is interested in being the center of the limelight. All of us are interested in supporting others in this work of public service to shine, to be even better at what they do. And all of us come from a conviction that I know you share, and we will talk about a little bit longer. I hope, especially through the lens of your most amazing book, we all believe that our world is so incredibly diverse. It is inspired by different faiths, and like we are, we believe interfaith is a way of life, not simply an organizational mandate, but actually a way of life. And we're committed to serving that socially cohesive space. So those who have no faith are as important as those with different faiths.
Yeah,
we believe in that aspect of social cohesion, but we also believe it requires being sensitive, being sensible about faiths, the diversity of faiths, and what the coexistence means of different faiths traditions and no faiths. And because we think that if you're very sensitive to the roles of faith, you are equally sensitive to those who have no specific faith, but are still extraordinarily committed to the space of social cohesion. So that is basically what we are committed to doing together. We are an international consultancy, so it's for profit for sure, but we are committed to supporting not for profits with our time and with our expertise whenever asked. We end up doing more pro bono than we actually do for profit. So it's an interesting space. Yes, you understand how that works, especially as women, you kind of fall into it almost naturally. Yes, of course, yes, of course, yes, of course. But that's where we are. We're based in different parts of the world. So, and we have, like you, some incredibly competent professionals who are men and who have been serving in different spaces of professional competence and public service for decades as well. So, given your book, we wanted to have this conversation with you. Our podcast often is about trying to showcase different experiences. It isn't necessarily the big names and those already in the limelight. It is the average, ordinary people who are serving with their passion as their passion and who are doing some remarkable work. And we want to lift that up. We want to learn from those experiences. So that's really the heart of the podcast series on leadership. And we're delighted that you agreed to be with us today. And so I'm going to introduce you now a little bit more formally. So bear with me.
Well, first, let me say.
Sure, go for it. Go for it.
If I can. It's those values that you talked about that attract me to Lead Integrity that I want to have my name associated with that. And the reality is, it probably is going to take a group of women leaders to lay the foundation for more organizations to openly profess those values and build their business model firmly on that. And so that's the interest I have with lead integrity. And I'm
Thank
really glad that you've taken that initiative to do it.
Thank you very much. We're deeply grateful to have you in our midst and to have your wisdom as our senior advisor. Thank you for saying that. It does mean a lot. We don't take any form of respect or appreciation for granted. None of us do.
Um,
We know that it's something, whether it's respect or appreciation, something that we have to constantly work hard to earn and to build through service. So I appreciate it very much that you say that. So Dr. Brian Adams is the chair of the governing board for A Common Word Among the Youth, the acronym of which is ACWAY, which is an international NGO supporting youth leadership in interfaith and intercultural dialogue. Brian is also the founding director of the Center for Interfaith and Cultural Dialogue in Brisbane, Australia, and an architect of the G20 Interfaith Forum, among other dialogue platforms. Brian has over 20 years of experience working in Africa, Europe, North America, and the Asia Pacific, gaining fluency in French and Swahili, along with his native English. A holder of a doctorate of philosophy and political science and 2 master's degrees in community development and conflict resolution, Dr. Adams focuses on the promotion of interreligious, intercultural, and interorganizational respect and understanding. As a former Rotary Peace Fellow, Brian is primarily focused on promoting respect and understanding across cultural, religious, and organizational boundaries. When I asked Brian to tell us a little bit, to whet our appetite on his most amazing book, Training Ninjas, Aspirational Leadership, or Why Teachers Are the Leaders Our World Needs, which is a book he put together based on the lessons that he was learning as he taught and served in an elementary school. When I asked Brian to tell us a bit about the book and how he wants to put as a central theme some of the conversation today, here's what he wrote, and I am quoting. The world is thirsting for leadership, new leadership from outside the systems that have created the crises that overwhelm our planet. To quench this thirst, many are turning to strong-voiced actors who claim the ability to solve our problems by taking firm control of the reins of power and tearing down or overturning institutions that impede their plans. But there is a second option, where instead of looking for leadership from political, business, or social media personalities, we look for this leadership in our homes and communities, end quote. Brian, you have captured the essence of what all of us in this space, especially
yeah.
the lead integrity space, absolutely believe in and are very much committed to helping to realize. So, given your book, again, the title, Training Ninjas, Aspirational Leadership, or Why Teachers Are the Leaders Our World Needs, you have presented a new model of leadership, one that tries to focus on helping individuals and communities aspire and unleashing tremendous potential that lies within each of us to build a better world. Tell us a little bit about how you came to the lessons in this book and some of the moments that most inspired you to write what you do. And then tell us a little bit about the book.
Okay. Well, what led me to writing the book, so for years, so for 10 years, I directed the Center for Interfaith and Cultural Dialogue out there in Brisbane, Australia, that you mentioned. And in that role, I worked with a broad range of community leaders, government, policing, religious, NGO, a wide range, but also, which is how you and I met, we engaged internationally and did quite a bit of work internationally. So advising organizations, large and small, plus governments in almost 40 different countries. And so I had the opportunity to rub shoulders with some amazing leaders, right? And even incorporate those lessons in training that I did for leaders, but also trying to build what I called inclusive leadership, leadership that engaged with multicultural diversity, um, but also different perspectives to inform their leadership and to achieve the outcomes that, were really beneficial to their organizations or their communities or societies that they serve. And I had a strong framework. I myself have been a community leader in my own community, as well as a senior leader at the university and with some of these other dialogue platforms that you mentioned. And so leadership was a very important topic that I would read about and ponder deeply on and have lots of discussions around.
Mm.
But then COVID came and it upended my world like it did so many others, including um, it made travel back home very difficult. We're originally from the United States, but we were in Australia for many, many years. That's where all of our children were born, for example. And it kind of closed off, family and important things to us. But also, it hit the Australian university sector very hard, and my center was closed down as part of the cost-saving exercise that takes place in times of crisis like that. And so we came back to the U.S., hoping to reconnect with family more closely, but also to position ourselves professionally over here. But that was much more challenging than I thought it would be, Aza. Um,
Can
to
you say a
to
little bit,
find,
can you elaborate a little bit about that, please?
yeah, a number of reasons. I was in some cases, too old, too expensive for people to be interested in, too experienced for some roles. I didn't have the networks in the United States that I had internationally, so that made it difficult. But also the work that I did and how I positioned myself, engaging with diversity, building community. In the US, that's framed as part of diversity, equity, and inclusion rather than community building or engagement or social cohesion. And I don't have the phenotype to to lead major initiatives in DEI, framing here in the United States. But also, um, I didn't have the the language for engaging in that space, since that's not how I framed my work up to that point. And so, yeah, there were a number of obstacles for that. So, kind of in between consulting contracts and applications for different jobs, um, I took a role as a substitute at an elementary school, a full-time substitute. And it was where my children were going. And it was a good opportunity to spend time with them, and to make a little bit of money and to learn a new thing, while I had the time. Because, my previous role was very, very demanding, travel and community responsibilities and all of that. It was a time to step back, but it wasn't in my career plan. I have to confess, going from, head of a university center that advise organizations and governments around the world to a substitute teacher at an elementary school. Um, it was quite different, but I loved it. I loved working with the kids. I loved the getting to know the teachers and the work that they did. But I began to notice and actually take note of the leadership that these teachers evinced that they showed in their work. And I began to think, teachers are amazing leaders.
Mhm. Mhm.
Now, you can tell by the color of my hair, it's been a while since I spent time in elementary school. And this was a very different experience. I came in with a new lens, right, where leadership was important to me. And I began to apprentice with some of the very best leaders our society produces, in my opinion. And I thought, I'm going to write these lessons down. I'm going to, start applying them in my life. But as I began to write them down, um, I began to notice that that some of the teachers had an extra focus to their role.
Mhm.
Now, traditionally, and I don't mean to be too professorial here, but I had always kind of categorized leadership in three ways, Aza.
Mhm.
You have your productivity leadership focus, you have your bridge building leadership focus, and that's the work that you and I have
Yes.
committed our lives to,
Yes.
is that focus. And then there's a third that I'd always seen as a teaching or an education focus.
Right. Mhm.
But I began to realize that these many of these teachers had another focus to their leadership that was quite different from the other three and just as legitimate. And I finally just called it aspirational leadership,
Mhm.
where they had a focus not just to impart knowledge or the means to obtain knowledge,
Mhm.
but to actually lift and guide others to find their aspiration and build towards it, build a life towards it.
Wow.
And that's different than these other forms of leadership, these other leadership foci that I was talking about. And as I grappled with it and tried to articulate it, as an academic and a writer, it naturally came through writing that I was trying to understand it. And from that, I thought, I'm gonna write a book on this. This is important. Um, and to me, revelatory. So yeah, that's kind of what led to me doing it. But
Fantastic.
there's some sub themes to it. I have to say. One is, the little whetting of the appetite that I talked about. Our leadership system in many ways is broken or severely damaged, and we've got to figure out some way to pull together and to look for sources of leadership that'll actually lift us and help us together address these challenges we're facing. And so instead of, turning to these titans of business or these, long-term successful politicians or these social media influencers or political pundits or television personalities, those that have already a huge following, instead of turning to them for leadership, acknowledging that leadership can be found around us, um, and maybe we need to be looking there. And elementary school teachers are a great source of that. They're a great example of leadership, but they're also a great example of what I mean, that leadership, great leadership can be found in our communities. We don't have to look elsewhere for it. And so the book is just about lessons on leadership that I learned from the teachers, plain and simple.
So, on that note, we very rarely remember to look at those who have influenced our lives most from a very,
Right,
very young age when we were actually just beginning to appreciate everything. We rarely look at teachers, even though many of us have plenty stories about teachers who have influenced us
right. Hmm.
or worse. But I would love to have you share a little bit of what specific instances of this building aspirations amongst young kids. What specific instance? Give us an example.
I'm sorry, it's breaking up a fair bit, Asa.
I'm really sorry to hear that. I'm not quite sure why.
Yeah.
I was just saying, if it would be possible for you to give us an example or a couple of example, concrete instances of this, of what struck you about building aspirational leadership.
Yeah, okay. And the book is actually full. I use every chapter I try to draw examples from the playground or classroom experience or my own past that demonstrates this. I'll I'll share one. So there's one of the first chapters is on aspiration and trying to define what it means and why it's such a powerful objective or a powerful focus for a leader to try to instill in those that they lead. And the example I use is of these two boys that participated in the mileage club at the elementary school. And the mileage club was every Wednesday. The kids at recess would have an opportunity to run around the track or walk around the track and get as many laps in as possible. And then they would be recognized, giving little tokens to show how far they've gone. And there was a fifth grader who was a very good athlete and made sure everybody knew he was a very good athlete. He was the best in the school, right? But then this skinny little third grader, new to the school, shows up and learns of this mileage, goes for it. And every recess, every Wednesday, he would be out there running around, just from as soon as the bell rang at the start to as soon as the bell rang at the end. And towards the end of this period for the mileage club, we announced, here are the leaders in their various grades. And it just so happened that this third grader was, no pun intended, miles ahead of this fifth grader, who was the school athlete, right? Who was known as, and was very proud of that fact. And while that isn't the example that I want to hit, what followed is, what happened was this fifth grader stopped running.
Oh,
And it was so sad to see. And I thought about this, and I worked with them. I mean, I knew the fifth grader really well. But it turns out when he realized he didn't have a chance of winning, meaning catching this third grader, he's like, no, I'm not doing it anymore.
wow. Hmm.
And so the idea that one of the lessons I drew from this in comparing or contrasting these two is that one had an internal motivation. He aspired to not, he didn't have as his goal to be the number one runner in the school. He was just a third grader, right? And he didn't even think he could beat fourth and fifth graders, right? That wasn't his goal. But his aspiration was to see if he could get as many laps as he possibly could in each recess,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
While the fifth grader, his goal was externally motivated,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
He liked people recognizing him as the best athlete, as the number one. And as soon as that recognition was taken away and given to somebody else, even worse, a skinny little third grader, he no longer had that aspiration anymore. And it wasn't an aspiration. He no longer had that inspiration to push him along. And so I use that as an example to differentiate between inspiration and aspiration, external motivation versus internal motivation, and what that means, the focus it provides, the motivation through difficult times it can provide. Because, it rained on some Wednesdays, or it was snowing on some Wednesdays, right? But he kept going.
Hmm.
Um, the little third grader. And I also use it to talk about this idea of agency,
Hmm.
that aspiration, a real aspiration, gives us greater agency in our lives. It gives us control over something that is uniquely ours.
Hmm.
So that's one of the examples from the book that I use.
Beautiful. Very, very profound. Thank you very much for sharing that. Since you shared it, could you tell us when you expect the book? I understand you're still working on it, or is it now?
There's a publisher in Canada who's expressed interest in it, and we'll see where that goes.
All right.
So we're working on it.
Absolutely, fingers crossed. This sounds incredibly important and interesting. Given
Yeah.
what you've just said, to distinguish between inspiration and aspiration and or how they are linked,
Yeah.
maybe just to take you somewhere else
Sure.
on there, but very much I think linked to that, because what you have just elucidated helps me understand a great deal of how some of our leadership seem to perhaps not be as we think they could or should. But maybe just think a bit with me and help us understand your vision, your understanding of the kind of interfaith space and leadership that exists today. How do you see what's going on in the interfaith world? And some of the events and the issues, and not necessarily naming any organization, but the global interfaith space, which is perhaps more prominent and paid attention to, including by
Mhm.
those outside of the faith space completely, than it ever has been in since it's sort of as we define
Yeah, that's
it.
right.
Tell me a
Yeah.
bit about your own readings of the leadership in these spaces and what you see happening within those spaces. Just a synopsis of your read.
Uh, yeah, I agree. Interfaith dialogue, interfaith collaboration has grown in its profile the last 10 or 15 years, quite a bit. And with that comes challenges. Some of those challenges are opportunists saying, "Oh, look, here's the chance for me to um, be in the spotlight or to take the pedestal." Um, it can be co-opted by various interests or organizations to promote their own brand or their own agenda. And so we're seeing that with certain uh, it's a challenge to interfaith uh, work, interfaith respect and understanding. And um, let me to answer your question, let me go back to the book for a second, because there's a way to kind of frame this. Now, I say in the book, so the book is about aspirational leaders, building aspirational leaders, or those leaders who are equipped to help others aspire, right? And to strengthen them and guide them along that way. And I say a leader has four assets. To define a leader, they have four assets that they are willing to contribute to their movement or their organization or their group, right? And those assets are framing, focus, funding, and a figurehead role, right? Four F's of these. And so looking at an interfaith leader, I would say that they would frame their work in a way that would bring a broad group of people who have different confessions, be they religious, philosophical, or atheistic, together, right? That would be how they would frame it. They would focus that framing by um, targeting specific needs, directing their work towards that, by introducing certain policies or procedures that would facilitate bringing those people together to address that need. And then they would fund that, not just financially. When I talk about funding, these are resources that would use to um, increase the capacity to achieve those objectives. So that could be their reputation. That could be the legitimacy of the organization that they step into, as well as financial or other resources. And then they themselves would be a figurehead for that. They would do their best to promote those values, to achieve, to adhere to that vision and move towards it by bringing people together. Those are the four that I say are a leader. There are other things that people do in leadership, of course, but those are the four essential characteristics or assets that a leader has. And so you could use that as, say, an evaluative tool for some of the interfaith movement or leadership that we see out there. You know, are they framing it in a way? Is it to promote their own interests, their own brand, or their own agenda, or is it to bring people together to address a focus that is clear and it's working towards. So, but as you know, interfaith people get involved in interfaith for many different reasons. Sometimes it's a proactive engagement to better understand what's out there and um, to to identify what challenges may lie or dangers may lie for their community currently or in the future. Sometimes it's very altruistic. Sometimes it's driven by a deep-seated doctrine or theology that pushes them towards others to engage with others. Sometimes it's purely political power move. There are lots of different reasons, and we see it in our interfaith leadership, evidences of all of those. Yeah.
I'm curious about your point about the different forms of the different motivations, and you mentioned the word opportunism or
Yeah.
opportunistic. And
Mhm.
what could be the, I mean, you one naively, I think, tends to believe that faith is about this, do good, be good with one
Yeah.
another,
Yeah.
create good, etc.
Yeah.
So why and how would opportunists find an interfaith space, dialogue, or collaboration? And by the way, there's a big difference. We'll get to that in a second between interfaith dialogue and interfaith collaboration. But
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
first, maybe just dwell a little bit in terms of understanding why this space would even be interesting for opportunists. Like, what would opportunists want from this kind of a space?
Um, well, I'll talk. So we've been talking kind of internationally in the international interfaith movement. Let's drop down to more of a community level. Um, Faith communities. Now, you've pointed out I have a PhD in political science, so I think in political terms, in governance, in allocation of resources and power, all of that. So please pardon me for my bias that's driving perhaps a response to this particular question. But faith groups, faith communities can also be seen as political communities.
Mm, yeah.
Uh, and they aren't, they have come together with a unified identity of a particular confession. But that doesn't mean they're monolithic. And that doesn't mean that all within it are have achieved sainthood.
Mhm.
That there are many different reasons to be involved in that particular community, that confession. And I have worked with many who see interfaith as a way to sidestep perhaps some of the hierarchy that's there and gain a bit of position and voice and power, sometimes for very legitimate reasons, as in they're never going to have their voice heard if they stay within the simple structures of that community, but also because they may be seeking power,
Mm,
uh, and so they'll be involved in it in that way. And interfaith, um, what it provides an opportunist from within a faith community is a broader audience to recognize their voice, to promote. And sometimes they use it as leverage within their own community for greater recognition, respect, or even followings within. So that's a bit theoretical without naming particular people
oh,
or
good. We
community.
don't need to name them. We don't need to
That's
name
right.
them. I think
That's right.
I think you've actually hit the nail on the head by even, and I think it's because we're political scientists, we would see it that way, perhaps in ways different than what other, not
Yeah.
perhaps, for sure differently than how religious leaders, for instance,
Mhm.
may see it, which
Yeah.
is we see the religious community as a political community. In fact, it's the original political
Yeah,
communities.
that's right.
Long before we had political parties and governments, we had religious communities
Religious communities. Yeah.
who were the quintessential political community. Um, as we know it today and as we understand it to be. So I think you've given us an interesting perspective, which to me makes a lot of sense, being a fellow political scientist, that
Mm,
indeed, a religious community, whether that happens to be a religious institution or
right.
even a religious NGO that is providing
Mm,
certain services, or just faith communities in general, are the original political communities. And as such, some of the same dynamics that we see playing out in the political communities play out obviously in the religious
yeah,
ones as well.
right.
Um, and it's interesting that are actually having the coincidence of having this conversation at the same time that, um, very unfortunately, His Holiness Pope Francis is very seriously
Mm,
ill, and the community of the Vatican, the Holy See, has to now group to assess how to
hmm
move forward, and that is a political process as well,
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
much so,
hmm
with competing interests and visions and aspirations, per your point,
Yeah.
and certainly competing inspirations as well. And so I wonder, you can see that happening quite a bit with specific religious communities. Muslim, Christian, Hindu,
hmm
Buddhist, etc. With all their diversity, like you said, they're not monolithic by any stretch of the
Right.
imagination. They're incredibly diverse internally. Oh, you mentioned that the interfaith space provides an opportunity to be seen as a leader in ways that perhaps your own community, specific religious community, may not see you or doesn't wish to see you. But it also provides, I would assume, an opportunity to be able to get certain ideas across, certain things more palatable within an interfaith space than they would have been if you were only talking to your own faith
Yeah.
community. You know?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think this is something that often gets forgotten, that we actually have certainly a lot of challenges, which we'll talk to in a minute, but there's opportunities of opportunities that interfaith spaces make available.
Right.
Can you think of some of those opportunities?
Yeah. Um, I can I can think of, let me see, I'll try to start at the individual, then go to community, and then maybe societal or something. We'll build from there. So individually, I'll speak of myself, the space that interfaith has made available to me.
Hmm.
Uh, you mentioned when you were introducing me that I speak a couple of other languages,
Yeah.
like you, and I uh, I have found in learning other languages that um, that doors have been opened that I've never been able to pass through, to
Hmm.
have experiences and connections and rich learning that I would never have been able to if I didn't study that language, learn that language, and use that language.
Hmm.
At the same time, I haven't been hit with the realization, you know what? English is stupid. I don't like English anymore. In fact, Swahili is better, or French is better, or any of these other languages. No, the opposite has happened, in which I am a better English speaker and writer because I've learned these other languages. I've had to reflect back on my own language. Why do we do that? Why do we say that? What does that actually mean when I say that?
Mhm.
And that experience, that opportunity to reflect on what was innate in me, my English language, is the same with interfaith dialogue or interfaith connections. And if I had stayed within my own community, um, I would be a very different Christian than what I have become through interfaith dialogue. I haven't said, "Oh, my religion is totally dumb," now that I've met these other religions, right? Not at all. I'm like, wow. Not only have I learned and grown and had wonderful connections
Hmm.
through these opportunities, these spaces provided, but at the same time, I understand my own so much better, and I've become a better disciple, and a better um, liver of these principles than I would have if I hadn't engaged in this way. And so that's a personal example, at the very individual level, what some of these spaces provide.
Yes. Yes, brilliant. And it's interesting that you brought it from the perspective of language, which
Mhm.
indeed is quite, I never thought of it like that before. I always thought we hear, being involved in interfaith dialogue has helped deepen my awareness of my own faith, my appreciation of my faith through the eyes and the words of learning of the other faith traditions. And I've heard that a lot, and I believe it's very, very true. But it's interesting that you brought in the metaphor of language as well, that when you learn the other's language, you reflect more deeply and perhaps appreciate more some of the aspects of your own language. Um, is there another side to that, though, that is less empowering, less positive, less whatever in this interfaith space? Do you think
It,
that it might actually lead to other things which are not quite as empowering?
well, um, I think I see where what's driving that question, but I'm going to put a twist on it.
Good, go for it.
And I'm going to say there are challenges with it that I never thought I would face.
Mhm,
Um, how can I put it? Um, well, one is within my own faith community,
mhm,
right? I mean, we talked just a little bit ago, even within the same community, the same, you know, in the same town, the same faith community, there's still a broad range of views. And so, there have been times where I have been accused of consorting with the enemy, right? In engaging in interfaith, that these more fundamental aspects of my own religion would see what I'm doing as not only a waste of time, but actually sinful. You're working against what God would want, right? And that's very confronting, because they are attacking what is deeply personal to me, that is part of my identity, right? And that's something that I always try to raise when I facilitate a dialogue or build a dialogue platform. It's recognition that we are asking people to come and present to others who, by definition, do not believe as they do these very core aspects of their identity. It's rarely in society do we have those opportunities or those expectations, which of course leads me in another path in which that's part of the challenges we have with the division that we currently face in our societies. This polarization is there. We don't have this tradition, this set of norms to help us um, open up in the face of those who believe very differently than us. And I think that's one of the powers and potentials of interfaith dialogue, is providing a framework for being able to do that. But I digress. So it's very confronting in that way, where I didn't realize I would have to evince moral strength within my own community when I'm driven by the very values that we apparently share to engage in interfaith dialogue. And so that was very, very challenging. So that was just something I wanted to
So,
bring
so
to
let me understand you. You're saying that by engaging in interfaith dialogue, some within your own community felt that this was going outside of the boundaries of what is possible and acceptable. Is that
hmm
what you're saying? And
Yeah,
then you then have to figure out how to deal with that within your own community.
that's right.
Okay, absolutely. I completely understand that. And I,
Mhm.
I think we all
I'm
share
sure you can. Yeah.
it. There's always those within our own who can be particularly um, uncomfortable, to put it
Yeah.
politely,
Yeah.
with us stepping to meet the other in a space of respect,
That's right. Yeah.
non-judgmental. But I actually have the better religion. I'm the right one.
That's right. That's right.
Attitude. I
Yeah.
think that does indeed threaten quite a few. And I sometimes wonder whether the increased sectarianism we see around the world today, some of
Yeah.
it deliberately harvested and
Mhm.
pushed, and some of
Yeah.
it just a feature of the increasing polarization we see around us.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
wonder whether that sectarianism, for lack, those divisions, religious divisions, for lack of a better word, might actually make that more the case as time goes on.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah,
We're at.
yeah.
But I've also wondered, Brian, because of course, as a woman of faith in interfaith and within interfaith spaces, I think there's a particular set of challenges that comes with that. That this is not to say, oh, us women we're oppressed, we're downtrodden, it's not that, but
Right, right.
it's those it's those attitudes that you sometimes find in religious spaces that you also, at least I am, surprised and sometimes shocked to find in interfaith spaces, because I assume clearly
Yes, yeah,
naively,
that's
that
right.
the interfaith should have, in a way, should not include the misogynistic, the patriarchal, the
Mhm.
the male dominated vision and
Yeah,
lens on life. I
yeah,
assumed that the interfaith space wouldn't have that,
yeah, that's right.
but it does.
It
And
does. Yes. Oh yeah. That
but
yeah,
how
you
is
would
that possible? How's that possible? You're supposed to be in this interfaith space where you see one another from different religions, from different
yeah,
faiths,
that's right.
as people of equal value and worth in the eyes of the divine.
Yeah.
And yet you will still distinguish and look down upon in very subtle ways, mind you. Never very, very clearly, unless you're absolutely pushed. And then in that case, there's a problem anyway. But
Yeah.
in very, very subtle, coated, incredibly beautifully coated words, actions, still looked down upon very much because you're female. Or
Yeah.
God forbid, you're not even male or female, you're something else. So how does that prejudice persist? And what does it mean for interfaith?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a good question. I well, to look at the first one, how does that persist? Um, I- One of the other things that's was very confronting for me when I started to engage professionally in interfaith dialogue as director of the center was yeah, it's interesting. How can I put it? I went with the expectation that I thought I understood, okay, they don't believe as I do, and that's all right. But I still went with the expectation that while they don't believe as I do, I really think they believe as I do. And what I mean is, I went, okay, yeah, they're going to be, Buddhist or Confucianist, Taoist or Jewish or, Muslim. So they don't believe as I do. But the things that are really driving me to do this, they believe in, which is we are equal in the sight of God. He loves all of us. We are better as we learn to work together and understand each other. And it was that belief that was shaken when I realized that they don't, that there are things that they don't believe. And even some don't believe that I am equal to them in value of what I could bring to the table. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I yeah, that took I had yeah, that was very challenging. It's uh that ultimately these people who don't believe as I do really don't believe as I do on
Right.
that second level.
Right.
And how I deal with it is sometimes not as well as others. I try to yeah, sometimes it's very tough. I had one person, I'll give you an example.
Yes.
Um, we were doing some work in the United Arab Emirates,
Mhm.
and in in the Emirates, not every emirate is the same. Just because it's all one, you know, entity, the Emirates are very, very different. And so my own faith tradition, I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, wasn't recognized in some of the Emirates. And but in my role as, leading interfaith work in that area, it was very confronting to some people who were like, why is this person who isn't even allowed to express their beliefs in our country leading an interfaith platform or advising our minister for such and such on interfaith dialogue? And should we have this person or representative from their tradition speaking at this conference?
Mhm.
I propose that they be treated like heretics and run out. And this is from a very, very senior leader in another tradition participating in this. And in that instance, I remember it was very confronting. I mean, you may be able to imagine that, Asa.
Yes, yes, I may indeed, from a slightly different vantage point, which
That's right.
both religious, as like your religion cannot possibly
That's right.
be part of this.
And and I have to be careful here because in saying that this happened at the United Arab Emirates, people are going to assume this was a Muslim that was saying this, and it was not. It was another
Oh,
Christian
good that you
that was saying this. So
very, very
I want to make that clear. This is not, and in fact, it was a member of the royal family who stepped in and said, "No, we're not going to let you have this attitude in our country. This is how we're going to do it." And the sheikh stood up for me in my beliefs, even though he had, of course, no desire to be a member of my group or anything like that, right? And but I still had to, as leading this initiative, still had to work with this person that I knew.
saw you as a heretic.
Yes, yes, and would willingly promote others treat me as such. And so that was very, very challenging.
Mm.
But I also felt that while there were perhaps political reasoning behind this, that this was still a person and that um, my options were either to try to shun them or bring them on board and perhaps they would change their attitude. And I took the second and began to develop better relationships with this person. And I think it did change the mind of that person. Um, yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's a very illustrative point about some of what happens in
Yeah.
spaces that we will rarely speak to or talk about.
Mhm.
And I think, thank you for clarifying that it wasn't necessarily someone
Yeah.
from another completely different faith tradition, but actually technically your own
Mhm.
community
Yeah.
of believers. Um, and herein, I think you've nuanced very clearly some other aspects of that challenge is that you had spoken to earlier, which is that sometimes those within your own community, broadly defined,
Yeah. Yeah.
can be some of your harshest detractors, the
Mhm.
ones who give you an especially rough time,
Yeah.
and including in interfaith settings. So it doesn't just happen when you're outside of those settings and within and among
Yes. Yeah.
those, but it can actually happen and does play out in interfaith settings themselves, that you find that those who are technically supposed to be your brothers or sisters
Mhm.
from the same community writ large can be the ones advocating against you
Oh, yeah.
in
Yeah.
interfaith spaces. I
That's
think
right.
that, we rarely ever speak about that particular set of
Mhm.
challenges that come from, for lack of a better word, from within our own communities and are transposed into the interfaith.
That's right. Yeah.
And I think that's an important point. Another point I wanted you to just reflect with me for a second on has to do with um, those different hierarchies that you find within the interfaith space, because we assume this is a space of equal partnership and
Yeah. Yeah.
but there are definitely hierarchies, or not. I mean, am I wrong in understanding and having sensed the hierarchies of different religions,
Hmm.
related, sometimes perhaps more nuanced when it happens to be who's hosting? If the host happens to be a certain religious institution or a certain country with a certain dominant majority, are there are there power dynamics and hierarchies that happen in those spaces then, do you think?
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Mm.
Um, but I think you want more than just a yes or no answer to that.
If possible, but the yes is also very good here. At least one is definitely sure I'm not completely out of the picture. But yes, do please elaborate if you wish.
There definitely are. And um, it's you raise what is an opportunity, one of the greatest opportunities, yet also one of the greatest challenges of trying to build a dialogue platform. And by dialogue platform, I don't mean um, a dialogue initiative necessarily, but a structure that facilitates dialogue, okay, or collaboration.
Mhm.
Um, the the wonderful opportunity is as an interfaith um, as a leader in interfaith space, meaning someone who does try to build these dialogue opportunities. The
Mhm.
beauty of that is you can take a key role in helping to address those power imbalances. So I'll give you a quick example. Um, we had in Australia um, an initiative, a broad policy initiative called Countering Violent Extremism, which very quickly became a countering Islamization. It didn't address broader violent extremism, nor the drivers of it. It began focusing on that particular community. Unfortunately, that happened in many countries around the world as well. Is how it was interpreted, as you know very well.
Yes.
And what some of the outcomes of that were that the policing structures, the security structures of Australia, be it, city, states, or federal, weren't welcomed into Muslim spaces, be it a mosque or something like that, right? Nor vice versa. How many imams would go to the police headquarters, right, to meet and discuss? But because our center had developed, relationships and dialogue between various communities, we were able to provide a space for that very essential relationship building dialogue to take place. Now, it's not interfaith in the sense that it's police and Muslim. That's not interfaith, but it's still it's an example of what I'm talking about of
I see.
the opportunity and responsibility of leaders in the interfaith space to address those power imbalances, right? To lead to something that could be more productive, whole, and healing. So that's the opportunity. The challenge, of course, is when you have you're trying to let me think of an example. I have several in mind, but I'm trying to think of one that doesn't name name and shame.
Mhm.
Uh, I don't like to speak in abstracts because we're trying to. You asked a very practical question. So, okay. I'll finish off that last thought. And
Okay.
so what my role as an interfaith leader became was quite often uh, a translator between perspectives and worldviews in saying, look, if we do this, perhaps you're well-meaning, but this is how it's going to be interpreted. And therefore, it would be counterproductive to the objectives you're wanting to lead to. Now, so ACWay, of which I'm the chair of the Board of Trustees, a common word among the youth, we hold every year or every 2 years an international gathering. And this year, um, one of the major sponsors is a country, and we were going to hold our conference in Ethiopia,
Mhm.
right? To draw from to build up youth interfaith, intercultural leadership in sub-Saharan Africa, kind of draw upon that. Um, but also it's a capital for the African Union, and I mean, there's lots of reasons to hold a conference in Addis Ababa.
Of course.
Um, and one of the major sponsors is a country that um, has sponsored some of the ongoing attacks in Yemen, and therefore there are expectations on who can be allowed at that conference, um, what can be said at that conference,
Mhm.
um, and we have youth leaders. We don't have youth sheep attending this conference, right?
Understood.
And and so as a as you're trying to design this conference to facilitate understanding, do you leave out a particular group because they're not seen as legitimate or by a funder, or um, will it cause tension with other participants? That's part of the headache and the challenge of interfaith leadership. You led probably the premier interfaith dialogue organization, Religions for Peace, around the world, and I know you struggled with some of those very same issues.
Um, yes, I think there are, those issues are actually quite relevant across the board. What I found particularly interesting is that the tension between donors that is sometimes imposed by certain donors on an initiative that they donate to, whether they decide to host the initiative themselves or whether they decide to give money to have it done,
Mm.
that um, those tensions are actually the oldest challenge in
Yeah,
international development, right?
yeah, yes, that's right.
Of international development, and we know that there are donors and recipients, and we have so much written and researched over decades about this particular
Hmm.
set of challenges presented. To what extent do donors interfere? What do they, the conditionality of money and so on. And it was quite a revelation to realize, for me, to realize that these same
Hmm. That's right.
and realities are indeed very pertinent and pervasive equally to the interreligious
Yeah,
spaces.
yeah.
Who gets invited, who doesn't get invited, who gets to speak even when you're invited, who gets to speak, when do they speak, at which segment can they be
That's
heard.
right.
All of these are incredibly relevant aspects of the interfaith dialogue,
That's
just
right.
as they are in the international development and
Yeah,
foreign affairs and foreign policy and so on spaces. They're just as important, just as
right,
significant. Um, that was a surprise to me because I had again naively
right.
assumed that the interfaith was where good happened,
Yes,
where
yeah.
all the, say, if you will, oversights, to put it politely, downright manipulative exercises of human arrogance, to put it very neatly and truly, were not going to take place. This was now where you
Right. Yeah.
bring God, the divine, into the picture because you are ostensibly seeking that
Yeah.
part of our reality. And yes, it is supposed to be different from the secular norms and paradigms. It is supposed to be different. That's why we speak about faith-based and
That's right.
faith-inspired as
Yeah.
distinct from secular or non-faith inspired. Of course, they are different. And so the interesting thing was to realize that indeed it may be different, this divine spark, inspiration, hope, aspiration, but at the same time it is human beings who are still nevertheless engaging with one
That's
another,
right.
the
Yep.
same, the same ills or shortcomings,
That's
and
right.
sometimes the same beauty that
Yep.
is inherent in
Yes,
the divine
absolutely.
creation will come into this space as
Yep.
well. But
That's
it
exactly what
certainly
happened.
is a learning exercise, and I
Yeah.
think we see the plethora of interfaith initiatives around us today that you've studied, you've been part of, you are leading, have a lot to learn actually from
Hmm.
secular. Uh,
Yeah, that's right.
and it may well be time for us to see what the what the faith inspired, faith based interfaith has to learn from the secular.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because there's this understanding that no, 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 no. We've got it right. We've got our own ways of doing this. And because we're faith inspired, it's somehow different. And the truth
That's right.
is there's much to learn from
Yeah.
one another. So given that, and I'm just being conscious of the time and so grateful to you for all you have shared, let's go back to conclude. Let's go back to your book and some
Hmm.
of the lessons that you've shared that could actually be helpful for the interfaith world that we both are very passionate about. Can you maybe come back to just share a few lessons that help in the space?
Yeah. So in the book, um, so there's some discussion about leadership. Like I talked about the four assets of a leader. I think that's important for interfaith movement and leadership to acknowledge, to try to get their head around and work within. But the point of the book is to help build aspirational leaders, leaders who can help others aspire. And I think that's a space that interfaith leadership can step into and embrace that purpose. And so much of the book is explaining various principles that will strengthen you as a leader, as an aspirational leader. And so that I take from elementary school teachers. And the four in the book are the power of relationships, the power of intention, the power of culture, and the power of the playground.
Relationships, intention, culture, and playground.
That's right. That's right. And so how these relate. So the power of relationships, the power of interfaith dialogue is in many cases the relationships that are formed. And so as an interfaith leader, as a leader of interfaith initiatives, that should be at the forefront of what you're trying to produce. Not every single interfaith initiative has to, result in building relationships, but broadly, that is the foundation, I think, of if we want to establish respect and understanding between. And so there are techniques within that teachers use to help to understand that and to bring that to the forefront of the work they're doing. The second one is intention, and intention means two things. It means the reason you're doing something, but also the level of focus in the work that you're doing. And so as an interfaith leader, you would want to be clear about, what am I trying to achieve here with this gathering? Not just let's bring all these people of different faith and goodwill together and something good's going to happen. Well, as you have said, sometimes it doesn't. And let's have what that intention is, but then also be focused on trying to achieve that. And that it would include working with those who participate and say, you're wanting to be part of this. This is what we're trying to achieve. Are you on board with that? We don't know how to get there, but we're working towards it. And so trying to make it very clear that they've bought into a desire to try to achieve that. Okay. So that's the second one. The third one is the power of culture. Now, this is one of my favorite chapters in the book, partly because, I've lived in several different countries. I love working with culture. And the example I used to start the chapter is very personal to me. It was advice that a good friend of mine in Mali, when I was living in Bamako, Mali, gave me to help me out. But it also helped me realize culture isn't a divisive factor. It can be, but it can also be a cohesive factor. It can be something that, when defined or built with that intention, can actually bring people together. And so I had a lot of fun working through the power of culture and how it can be applied to bring people together. And this is something that an interfaith leader doesn't want to ignore, the culture of the movement or the organization that they're building or leading. And because culture does two things. There's lots of ways to look at culture, but it has two benefits as I see. One is it strengthens, it defines, and enhances the cohesion of the group and the identity of the individual with the group. Two, it propagates and perpetuates the values and beliefs of that group. So it helps it continue on for future generations. And that's very powerful. If you can harness something like that, then you've got something that is very powerful. And then there's the power of the playground. You know, what is the value of playground at elementary school other than just letting kids go crazy for a few minutes and then come back in? In fact, I think it's undervalued in a lot of our schools and wish there were more playground time because playgrounds, they that is where if we're talking about aspirational leadership, right? The greatest challenge to aspirational leadership that I see as a leader is you're not trying to achieve your KPIs or your outcomes. You're trying to help them identify what theirs are and help them achieve it. So you are, by definition, which is quite different from those other three, than productivity, than bridge building, or teaching. They have their set outcomes that they want to achieve. But an aspirational focus means you are trying to help people identify what those are and achieve that. So you're letting go of control. Yet you still are maintaining a fair bit of accountability over something for which you don't have a ton of control. And that's very, very challenging for leaders. And the playground is kind of a metaphor for that space, a space where you can let those that you lead have more control, where the relationship, the hierarchical relationship between leader and member or follower or whatever it is changed, where you aren't the leader, that you're working within their paradigm or their structures or their culture even. And that you're incorporating that into the objectives of your organization. So that's probably one of the more unique chapters in terms of leadership that this book has that you don't find in other books.
Mhm.
But those are four things that I think an interfaith leader would want to would use this book for to help them in their leadership.
Okay, so this is brilliant. And just to clarify, the
Yeah.
playground, the
Yeah.
playground in an interfaith space, what is the playground?
Yeah. Okay. So let me let's see if I can define it. So a playground has two aspects. One is it's a space for unstructured activities.
Mhm.
So a lot of interfaith dialogue, um, it's one or the other. It's let's get together and just kind of have a free-flowing chat and all that, which is fine. Um, but it's not necessarily going somewhere. And if you have an organization that's trying to lead to a particular objective or to help others achieve their objective, that's not the setting that you would necessarily have. On the other hand, I come from the conflict resolution background, negotiation, mediation, adjudication, very structured processes that interfaith dialogue is often put into as well. You can't overstructure something like this either. You can't turn it into a process, a template, right? And so you want a space that does allow for the leadership within the group to grow and emerge as well. So that's one of the aspects of the playground. It's a space for unstructured activities. The
Mhm.
second, it's a space where hierarchies are upended, where the relationships evolve and grow. And so I give the example of the playground where there's a little boy at the start of the year. I call him, well, I try not to use their real name, so let's make sure I get it right. Well, we will say, we'll just say Buddy, right? He's my little buddy, my playground buddy.
Mhm.
And at the start of the year, he would come up and he would hold my hand and just talk to me as we walked around, kind of keeping an eye on the other kids because he's a little guy, first grader, still really uncertain, right? But then he wanted to start playing. So after a couple 6, 8 weeks or so, he wanted to throw the football back and forth and then as the year went on, he made more friends and he wanted to go play football with his friends. And I was now hi, Dr. Adams, as he would run by. I was no longer his playground buddy. And the little guy, he was so adorable and, so dear to my heart. And the story is, but I use it to demonstrate the power of the playground. You know, there was a time where I was the leader. Then there's a time where I was the the team member. I played back and forth with him. And then there was a time where he didn't need me anymore.
Right.
And that's what an aspirational leader has to do. And that's the power of the playground. That wouldn't happen in the classroom. He wouldn't be taking over the class and teaching himself or teaching the rest of the class. But on the playground, he could be, he could grow into that over the year. In my role, the hierarchy we had changed. It went from, the big uncle, dad figure to the playmate to the, hey, hi, nice to see you as he goes and plays. And that's part of the power of the playground as well. And the challenge to leaders is how do you build that within your movement or your organization,
Right.
Which is quite challenging. But that's part of what the book is for, is to help address those questions and to give some guidance on that.
Absolutely brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. I wish that some of our interfaith gatherings could indeed resemble more of that shifting set of relationships, from being one leader, one sort of accompanier, follower, to a space where the inclusivity and the group come together and generate a dynamic of being at play with one another in a way that gives joy. I sincerely hope that is a scenario we can eventually see. I think we're living through a moment now when the increased structure and template of interfaith leaders coming together, or religious leaders coming together, and that being the interfaith.
Yes, that's right.
Is highly structured, usually one big round table or several small round tables, and then there's someone leading the conversation, etc., etc. I wish we had more of the playground in that space, but a respectful playground that is being built up to, where everyone is committed and accountable. And that might take some time. But thank you very much, Dr. Brian Adams. This has been incredibly inspirational, very instructive.
Yeah, thank you, Asa.
And I love how you have applied your learning, your wisdom, and your experience in an elementary school as a teacher to this otherwise incredibly complicated political, social, religious, international development, and so on space. I think it's extraordinarily instructive of precisely the kind of leadership, visionary leadership that we need. So thank you for being who you are and for doing what you do. And I look forward very much to continuing this journey with you, and to receiving your own inspiration and wisdom about how lead integrity can be just that kind of a space that can facilitate the power of relationships, the power of intention, the power of culture, and the power of the playground. We very much want that to be the kind of journey and accompaniment that we look to from you and with you. So thank you very much indeed, also for your time. I will now end the recording.
Right. Thank you very much, Asa. I really appreciate this opportunity. I mean, I love the book and I love what led to the book, but I really I'm very proud that it's something that you would find of value that would help lead integrity. And it's very humbling. Thank you very much.
Let's commit to the fact that when the book comes out, God willing, inshallah, we have a panel with you of colleagues from different walks of life that can speak to this dynamic relationship between your wisdom in the book and the interfaith world and international development, international foreign affairs, that God knows what we live in. And just have that conversation where you can continue to share and exchange the wisdom that is now officially part of your book launch, if you don't mind. Well, we'd love to be able to offer you that space if you will have us.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you very much.